Did you know that one of the greatest movies ever made was filmed in freezing cold wind on real working docks in New Jersey, and the actors were shivering for real? On the Waterfront came out in 1954, and it changed cinema forever. A story about a broken man who finally finds the courage to speak the truth. Simple idea, but the making of it? Absolutely wild. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about On the Waterfront. Number 20. The real frozen docks of Hoboken. In the winter of 1953, a film crew set up cameras on the real working docks of Hoboken, New Jersey. No studio, no fake sets, no warm sound stages with artificial wind machines. Just real wooden piers, real cold water, and real biting wind blowing off the Hudson River. Elia Kazan made a bold decision early on. He wanted the film to feel true. He wanted it to look and smell and feel like a real place where real people worked. So instead of building a Hollywood version of a waterfront, he packed his cast and crew and took them to an actual working port in the middle of winter. The crew had to work fast. Longshoremen still worked those docks every single day. Ships still came and went. The film crew had to shoot around the real working schedule of the port. Some days they had only a few hours before the area had to clear. That kind of pressure made everyone move quickly and think on their feet. There was no time for long rehearsals or comfortable breaks. You set the camera, the actors found their marks, and you went. Actors, the cold was not pretend. Marlon Brando, Carl Malden, Lee J. Cobb, they were all standing in temperatures near freezing with wind, cutting straight through their coats. When you watch the movie and see Brando hunch his shoulders or pull his jacket tighter, that was not acting. That was a man genuinely trying to stay warm. Kazan later said the real location gave the film something no studio could ever give: the texture of life. The cracked concrete, the rusty chains, the fog coming off the water in the early morning. It was all real, and the camera loved every inch of it. What looked gritty on screen was genuinely gritty behind the camera. Number 19. Frank Sinatra's lost role. Before Marlon Brando ever set foot on those cold docks, another man had been promised the role of Terry Malloy. His name was Frank Sinatra, and he was furious when the role was taken from him. Frank Sinatra was a huge star in 1953. He had just won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for From Here to Eternity. He was riding high, confident, and ready for a serious, dramatic comeback. When producer Sam Spiegel first started putting the film together, Sinatra's name was strongly connected to the project. He had the hunger, he had the grit, and he desperately wanted a role that would prove he was a serious, dramatic actor. But then Elia Kazan decided he wanted Marlon Brando, and had worked with Brando before on a streetcar named Desire, and he believed Brando had a raw, wounded energy that was perfect for Terry Malloy. A man trying to find his soul. Kazan went with his gut. Sinatra was not happy. He was deeply upset. He reportedly called Brando Mumbles, a jab at Brando's naturalistic, sometimes soft way of speaking on screen. There was no warmth between the two men after that. Their rivalry became one of Hollywood's most famous quiet wars. But here is where the story gets even more interesting. Sinatra had actually prepared for the role. He had invested time and emotional energy into it. To lose it, not because of a bad audition, but simply because the director changed his mind, was a wound that did not heal quickly. Impossible to imagine anyone else playing Terry Malloy today. But the next time you watch that film, just close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine Frank Sinatra in that famous cab scene. It is a strange and fascinating thought, and it reminds us that the greatest performances in cinema history often came down to one phone call, one decision, one name chosen over another. It was a close call that changed everything. Number 18. Eva Marie Saint's very first film. When Eva Marie Saint walked onto the docks of Hoboken for the first time, she was not a movie star. She was a theater actress and television performer making her very first feature film. And she had absolutely no idea it was going to make her famous overnight. Eva had trained hard in New York's theater world. She was skilled, disciplined, and deeply serious about her craft. But film was a different world from the stage. The cameras were closer. The moments had to be smaller and more internal. What worked in a theater, projecting your emotion to the very back row, would look completely over the top on a cinema screen right in front of someone's face. Elia Kazan, who loved working with actors from the stage and from the actor's studio, believed Eva had something truly special. Naturalness to her, a quiet dignity that he felt was perfect for Edie Doyle, a good woman from a corrupt world who falls for the wrong man and gently, stubbornly tries to pull him toward the right one. Eva later described the whole experience as thrilling and terrifying at exactly the same time. The locations were rough, the schedule was demanding. She was surrounded by established names, Brando, Malden, Cobb. She was the newcomer in every room. But something magical happened. She matched every one of them. Scene by scene, she held her own completely. Her performance was gentle but powerful, soft on the outside but unbreakable underneath. She played Edie not as a victim but as a quiet force of moral courage. When the Academy Awards were announced, Eva Marie Saint won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. It was her very first film role. She walked onto that stage as both a new face in Hollywood and a winner all at once. She reportedly burst into tears backstage and said she had no speech prepared because she never truly expected to win. First film, first nomination, first Oscar. That was not luck. That was destiny. Number 17. The Glove. That changed the scene. There is a moment in On the Waterfront that film students and acting teachers still talk about today. Terry and Edie are walking together in a park, getting to know each other awkwardly, nervously, circling around feelings neither of them knows how to name. Then Edie drops one of her small white gloves. What happens next was not planned by anyone in the room. Kazan, watching from behind the lens, made an instant decision: keep every second of it in the final film. That tiny, strange detail, a big, tough man wearing a small woman's glove, said more about Terry Malloy than a full page of dialogue ever could. It was playful. It was vulnerable. That beneath all that toughness, Terry was a man who did not quite know how to be gentle, but was quietly trying his best. Marie Saint later said she was genuinely surprised in the moment. She had not rehearsed it. She had no idea what Brando was about to do. But her own natural reaction, slight amusement, slight warmth, was exactly the human response the scene needed. It became one of the most celebrated examples of method acting in cinema history. The idea is simple and powerful. Feel the moment and react truthfully. Do not act it. Just live it. Number 16. Leonard Bernstein's one and only movie score. People think of Leonard Bernstein, they think of West Side Story, one of the greatest musicals ever created. They think of concert halls and symphony orchestras and conducting the New York Philharmonic. They do not usually picture a movie about dock workers and mob bosses and cold winter streets. But Leonard Bernstein composed the music for On the Waterfront, and it was the only full Hollywood film score he ever wrote in his entire career. Bernstein was asked by producer Sam Spiegel to create a score that matched the rough, urban energy of the film. Bernstein threw himself into the work completely. He wrote music that was both edgy and deeply emotional at the same time. Jazz rhythms mixed with orchestral howled when it needed to growl and ached beautifully when it needed to ache. It sounded like the city. It sounded like exhaustion and hope, fighting each other note by note. Parts of the score were later adapted into a full concert piece called the Symphonic Suite from On the Waterfront, which Bernstein himself performed many times. It became a well-respected piece of concert music in its own right, performed in halls far from any movie screen. But here is the twist in the story. Bernstein and the studio clashed during production. Editing decisions changed how his music was placed and used in the film. Some of his musical cues were cut or moved around without his approval. Bernstein was reportedly frustrated and unhappy with the final result. The score earned an Academy Award nomination, recognition that the music had genuinely moved people. But Bernstein had made a quiet, permanent decision. He would not compose for Hollywood again. He returned to concert halls and Broadway and never looked back at the film world. One brilliant score, one frustrated composer, one decision that kept concert halls richer and Hollywood poorer for good. Number 14. The Pulitzer Prize Story. That started it all on the waterfront did not begin in Hollywood. It began in a newspaper. In 1948 and 1949, a journalist named Malcolm Johnson wrote a series of 24 articles for the New York Sun. The series was called Crime on the Waterfront. Johnson had spent months investigating the corruption, violence, and mob control running through the docks of New York City like rot through old wood. What he found was horrifying in its detail. Union bosses controlled which men got work each morning and which men went home hungry. Workers who complained were beaten. Some were killed. The mob took cuts from wages, from cargo, from every dollar that moved through the ports. Ordinary working men were trapped inside a system of fear with no clear way out, no union that actually protected them, and no government stepping in to help. Johnson's series was so powerful, so carefully reported, and so genuinely important that it won the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting in 1950. It was journalism doing exactly what journalism is supposed to do, putting light into dark places and making ordinary people impossible to ignore. Bud Schulberg read every one of those articles, and they changed him completely. He became obsessed with the story behind the story. He traveled to the waterfront himself, spent real time with real dock workers, and eventually wrote a screenplay that captured both the facts and the deeply human emotion behind them. The film was not just inspired by Johnson's journalism, it was shaped, bone by bone, by what those articles revealed. Mob boss character, the corrupt union, the workers living in daily fear, the lone man who finally breaks and tells the truth. All of it came from what real men had actually lived through on real docks in the real world. What looked like drama was actually history with a human face. Number 13. Rod Steiger in a Cab with Nobody. The scene inside the taxi between Marlon Brando and Rod Steiger is considered one of the greatest scenes in American cinema history. When Brando delivers those immortal words, the world holds its breath. It is perfect. It is heartbreaking. It is unforgettable. Here is the secret that very few people know. Rod Steiger performed his half of the scene without Brando there. By the time the crew had to film Steiger's close-up reactions, Marlon Brando had already finished his own work for the day and left the set. This was considered rude, even unprofessional, by every standard of filmmaking etiquette. Actors stayed to help their scene partner, even when the camera was pointed in the other direction. Common courtesy, basic respect. Brando left anyway. So Steiger sat alone in that cramped, cold prop cab and delivered his emotional reactions to an off-camera assistant who read Brando's lines flat from a script. The pain on Steiger's face during the scene, the guilt and the love and the terrible shame of a brother who did the wrong thing when it counted most. Steiger had to generate all of that entirely on his own. No one to act with. No real energy to respond to. Just a voice reading words, and Rod Steiger pouring his heart into empty air. Steiger was reportedly very angry about what happened. He said in later interviews that he never fully forgave Brando for the discourtesy. The two men were not close after that day, and yet the scene works. It works absolutely. Steiger's performance was so deeply felt, so internally true, that you would never know his scene partner was not even in the building. The moment became one of the most discussed examples in all of acting education, what it means to be internally committed to a scene regardless of what happens around you. That was not just acting, that was a man giving everything to an empty room. Number 12. The invisible genius behind the camera. Every frame of On the Waterfront feels like a painting. The shadows fall perfectly. The faces are raw and honest. Fog, the darkness, and the cold winter light all add up to something that feels almost like a poem about human dignity. And behind all of it was a man most casual viewers have never heard of, Boris Kaufman. Boris Kaufman was the film's cinematographer. His job was to decide how every single shot would look, where the camera would go, how the light would fall, what the audience would see and feel in their gut, from one cut to the next. Boris Kaufman was not just any camera operator. He was the younger brother of the famous Soviet filmmaker Dziga Vertov, the true pioneers of early cinema. Boris had grown up surrounded by film theory and visual art at the highest level. He understood images the way a musician understands silence, as something meaningful in itself, full of weight and possibility. For On the Waterfront, Kaufman made choices that were bold and quiet at the same time. He used natural light wherever possible, letting the gray New Jersey skies and cold morning sun do the emotional work the story required. He placed the camera very close to the actors' faces, making the audience feel as if they were standing right there in the scene beside these people. He let the ugliness of the docks exist without trying to make it pretty or cinematic in an obvious way. The result was a visual style that felt completely honest. Nothing was dressed up, nothing was romanticized. It was life as it actually was, hard, gray, textured, and full of a strange beauty that only exists in real places. Kaufman won the Academy Award for Best Cinematography in Black and White for his work on this film. Most viewers never consciously notice great cinematography. They just feel it in their chest. What the audience felt as emotion, Kaufman had quietly placed there frame by frame. Number 11. The $900,000 Miracle. On the Waterfront was not a big-budget Hollywood production by any measure. In fact, it was made for approximately $900,000. In an era when major studio productions routinely cost 5 to 10 times that amount, this film was working on a shoestring. Other films being made at the same time had massive studio sets, elaborate period costumes, and armies of production designers. Waterfront had cold working docks, borrowed locations, and a small, tight, committed crew that moved fast and wasted nothing. This was partly by design and partly by necessity. Elia Kazan and producer Sam Spiegel both believed the story needed to feel real, and reality does not look expensive. Polished surfaces and expensive lighting would have destroyed the very thing that made the film powerful. They kept the budget tight with purpose. They shot quickly. They used real people from the neighborhood as background extras. They spent money only on what the camera would actually see and feel. The low budget also meant there was almost no room for expensive mistakes. When you are shooting on real working docks with a limited daily schedule, you cannot afford to reshoot the same scene 15 times looking for perfection. One had to arrive prepared, focused, and deeply professional every single morning. Some of the most powerful scenes in the film were completed in only 1 or 2 takes. That urgency, that feeling that every moment is the only moment, actually became part of the film's living energy. You can feel it watching. Nothing is lazy. Nothing is comfortable. Everything is pressed close and real. When the movie came out and earned millions at the box office, when it swept the Academy Awards and permanently claimed its place in cinema history, people looked back at that tiny budget and simply shook their heads. $900,000, 8 Oscars, a place in film history forever. They made $1 do the work of 10, Marlon Brando and his beloved pigeons. One of the most tender and quietly revealing moments in On the Waterfront shows Terry Malloy up on a rooftop, carefully tending to his pigeon. He keeps them in a coop, feeds them by hand, talks softly to them, loves them with a gentleness that seems completely at odds with the rough, dangerous world he lives in. Part of Terry's character, that hidden, gentle side, feels completely and undeniably authentic on screen. It feels authentic because Marlon Brando genuinely loved pigeons. Before filming began, Brando spent real time on the actual rooftops of Hoboken, learning how to properly care for real birds. He did not need acting preparation for those scenes. He had a genuine personal connection to the animals. When the camera captured him holding a pigeon with his big, rough hands, the tenderness you see was not performed or manufactured. It was simply there. Brando's approach to acting, the method approach he had developed through years of work at the Actors Studio in New York, was built on the idea of using real personal connection to fuel a character from the inside out. If something in the script matched something genuine in the actor's own life or instincts, you used that. You did not act it. You lived it. Also served a much deeper role in the story itself. They were Terry's secret self. Living, breathing, fragile things he could care for in a world that was otherwise brutal and without mercy. The moment near the end of the film when Johnny Friendly's men destroy the pigeon coop is one of the most emotionally devastating scenes in the movie. It is not simply an act of violence. It is the destruction of the last pure, innocent thing left in Terry's life. Kazan understood this completely. He built the pigeon coop into the story not just as a character detail, but as a living emotional symbol. And Brando made it absolutely real, because for him it was. The camera showed a man and his birds. The heart understood it was showing something much deeper. Number 9. Bud Schulberg's Years of Listening. The screenplay for On the Waterfront was written by Bud Schulberg. But that screenplay did not come quickly or easily. It came after years of living in the right places, listening to the right people, and earning the trust of a world that had every reason not to trust outsiders. After reading Malcolm Johnson's Pulitzer Prize articles about waterfront crime, Schulberg became genuinely obsessed with the subject. He did not want to write a screenplay built on library research and second-hand information. He wanted to understand this world from the inside, the way the men who lived it understood it. So he went to the docks himself. Schulberg spent years visiting the waterfront. He talked to dock workers over early morning breakfasts. He attended union meetings. He sat in the diners and bars where tired men gathered after long shifts. He met widows of men who had been killed for speaking up. He talked to ex-boxers who had been steered into a life of petty crime by people they trusted. He listened to priests and investigators and regular working men just trying to keep their families fed and safe. All of that patient, careful listening became the blood of the script. Every detail was earned through real human contact. Every character was built on real people Schulberg had met and sat with and heard. The language, the specific way Terry speaks, the cold way Johnny Friendly threatens, the passionate way Father Barry preaches over a dead man, all of it was shaped by actual voices Schulberg had heard standing in the cold. When Schulberg finally assembled the screenplay with Elia Kazan, it had a density and authenticity that was genuinely rare in Hollywood at the time. Schulberg won the Academy Award for Best Writing, Story, and Screenplay for that work. It recognized not just the craft of the writing, but the years of honest human connection that made the craft possible. The script read like fiction. It was born entirely from truth. Number 8. 8 Oscars in one historic night. The 27th Academy Awards ceremony took place on the 30th of March, 1955. Hollywood was watching closely to see which film would dominate the evening. The Waterfront answered that question in a way very few had fully expected. The film had been nominated for 12 Academy Awards. It won 8 of them. At the time, that was one of the most dominant performances in the history of the ceremony, and it sent a clear message about where American cinema was headed. The 8 wins included Best Picture, Best Director for Elia Kazan, Best Actor for Marlon Brando, Best Supporting Actress for Eva Marie Saint, Best Writing, Story and Screenplay for Bud Schulberg, Best Film Editing, Best Art Direction for Black and White, and Best Cinematography for Black and White. Nearly every major category the film entered, it won. That kind of sweep said something powerful. It meant the film had been recognized not just for its story, but for every craft element that held it together. The editing, the look, the writing, the performances, the direction. All of it was judged to be the finest work of its year in a highly competitive field. Marlon Brando accepting the Best Actor Oscar was a moment people discussed for a long time afterward. He came to the stage and accepted the award in person with a brief and genuine speech that showed none of the antagonism toward Hollywood ceremony that he would become known for in later years. He was gracious. He was real. Eva Marie Saint, walking up to accept her Oscar for her very first film role ever, the night must have felt almost impossible to believe. She had gone from an unknown face on a cold dock in New Jersey to an Academy Award winner in the space of a single year. 8 statues, 1 film, one night that said everything that needed to be said. Number 7. Brando. Among the real working men, Marlon Brando did not just read about dock workers in preparation for his role. He went and found them and sat with them and listened. Before filming began, Brando spent extended time in Hoboken and along the New York waterfront, talking to the men who actually did the physical labor. Longshoremen who loaded and unloaded ships in every kind of weather, who hauled cargo through the cold and the rain, who sometimes had absolutely no choice but to do what the mob told them to do if they wanted to eat that week. Listen carefully to how these men spoke. the rhythm of their sentences, the things they said and the things they carefully avoided saying. He watched how they moved when they were bone-tired, when they were quietly angry, when they were trying very hard not to look afraid in front of someone dangerous. Absorbed all of it patiently and let it settle into his body. This was the method approach, working exactly as it was designed to work. Brando believed that if you truly understood a person's physical world, their daily habits, their language, the particular way exhaustion sat in their shoulders, then the performance would follow naturally without force. Emotions would arise on their own because the body and the mind were already in exactly the right place. The result was a performance that actual dock workers recognized as real when they saw it on screen. When the film came out, men who had spent their entire lives on the waterfront watched Brando move and speak and said plainly, "He talks like us. He moves like us." That kind of recognition from the very people whose story you are telling is something no acting technique alone can guarantee. It comes from respect, from genuine listening, from being willing to be honestly changed by the people you are trying to represent. What looked like acting was actually listening made completely visible. 6. The most controversial director in Hollywood. Elia Kazan directed On the Waterfront at one of the most painful and politically explosive moments of his entire personal and professional life. And the film cannot be fully understood without knowing what had happened to him in the 2 years before the cameras rolled. 1952, at the height of the McCarthy era, a terrifying time when the American government was aggressively hunting for anyone with communist connections, Elia Kazan appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He cooperated. He named names. He told the committee which of his colleagues and friends had been members of the Communist Party during the 1930s. The effect on those people was devastating. Some lost their careers immediately. Some were blacklisted from working in Hollywood for years. People in the arts community felt that Kazan had betrayed his friends and colleagues to protect his own career and freedom. The anger was real, and it lasted for decades. Kazan himself insisted he had done the right thing. He genuinely believed in speaking truth, even when that truth was painful and costly to people he cared about. And when he and Bud Schulberg, who had also cooperated with the committee, sat down to make On the Waterfront, a story about a man who testifies against a brutal, corrupt system and pays a terrible price for doing so, the parallel was immediately obvious to everyone watching. Was Terry Malloy Elia Kazan? The film his public justification? His confession dressed as entertainment? His argument to the world that being an informer could, under the right circumstances, be a genuine moral act of courage. Kazan never fully denied the connection. He said the film was about the real cost of speaking up. He believed that completely. Others disagreed just as completely. Never went away, not even when Kazan received an honorary Oscar in 1999 and half the audience refused to applaud. Like a movie about dock workers, was also a man arguing for his own soul. Number 4, the producer who would not give up. A film like On the Waterfront does not get made without at least one person believing in it completely, stubbornly, and almost irrationally long after reasonable people would have moved on. Person was Sam Spiegel, the film's producer. Spiegel was an extraordinary and unusual character, a Polish-born showman with a remarkable gift for finding great stories and an even greater gift for convincing skeptical people to fund them. He had already produced The African Queen, which won Humphrey Bogart his Academy Award. He understood quality when he recognized it, and he was willing to fight for it. When Elia Kazan and Bud Schulberg brought him the script for On the Waterfront, Spiegel immediately and clearly understood what this film could become. but getting it made was anything but simple. Studio after studio passed on the project. The waterfront subject was considered too dark and too unglamorous for mainstream audiences. There were concerns about the political overtones in a climate where anything that could be interpreted as controversial was dangerous. There were genuine doubts about whether American moviegoers would pay to watch a gritty story about dock workers and mob violence in the cold. Spiegel kept pushing anyway. He approached Columbia Pictures and eventually secured a green light, but the budget was kept deliberately small. That was acceptable. Spiegel was experienced enough to make the film work within those real limitations. He brought discipline and resourcefulness to every problem. During production, Spiegel was everywhere he needed to be. He managed logistics, smoothed tensions between cast and crew members, and kept the entire project moving forward when individual days became difficult. He had the deep instincts of a truly great producer, knowing precisely when to push hard and when to quietly step back. When the film became both a critical triumph and a commercial success, when it swept the award season and claimed its place in cinema history, Sam Spiegel accepted the Best Picture Oscar with the quiet, private satisfaction of a man who had been completely right all along. They told him it was the wrong film. He made it anyway. Number 3. The Waterfront Crime was completely real. On the Waterfront is a work of fiction. The characters are imagined. The specific events are invented. But the world it describes, the violence, the corruption, the complete and total control of working men by criminal forces, that was all completely, horrifyingly, and documentably real. In the 1940s and early 1950s, the docks of New York and New Jersey were controlled by organized crime with a thoroughness that was almost hard to believe. The International Longshoremen's Association was run by corrupt leadership with deep, open ties to the mob. Getting work on the docks was not about your skill or your effort or your reliability. It was about paying the right people, keeping your head down, and doing whatever you were told without question. System where workers gathered every single morning at the dock gates in the cold, hoping to be pointed at and chosen for that day's work, was a daily tool of complete control. The boss could pick his favorites and send every other hungry man home to his family with nothing. Workers who complained could be quietly and permanently removed from the morning list. Workers who spoke up publicly could be beaten badly. Workers who testified could be killed. This system destroyed families across entire neighborhoods. Men who depended on dock work for survival lived in constant low-grade fear and economic poverty. The mob took money from everything, from the cargo moving through the port, from the wages of the men doing the work, from the very daily existence of human beings who had no other options available to them. Government investigations eventually began seriously exposing this system in the early 1950s. Journalists like Malcolm Johnson helped make the public aware of what was happening just across the water from New York City. Films like On the Waterfront gave this ongoing human suffering a face and a voice that newspaper articles alone never quite could. A story that began in real darkness helped move real light in the right direction. Number 2. Lee J. Cobb and the Monster. He built Johnny Friendly, the mob boss who controls the waterfront with his physical presence and the specific quality of his cruelty, is one of the truly great villains of American cinema. Watching him on screen, you believe every threat he makes. You feel the danger radiating off him in waves. And the man who built this monster from the inside out, Lee J. Cobb, was nothing like him in ordinary life. Lee J. Cobb was a thoughtful, soft-spoken man who had spent years doing serious and demanding theater work in New York. He was best known among theater people for creating the original role of Willie Loman in the first Broadway production of Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, one of the saddest, most deeply human characters ever written for the stage. He was an actor of great intelligence and careful emotional craft. But Elia Kazan asked him to play a monster, and Cobb delivered something genuinely terrifying. Johnny Friendly in the film rules through pure physical presence and unpredictability. He is loud when loudness serves him, and quiet when quiet is more frightening. He is genuinely dangerous. Watching Cobb, you believe without any doubt that this man could order someone's death at dinner without losing his appetite. In the very next moment, you see the broad charm, the laugh, the backslapping warmth, the big generous energy that explains completely why people follow him. That combination is what makes him so threatening. Monsters who seem like friends are the most dangerous kind. That balance between menace and charisma is extremely difficult to perform convincingly. Too much of one element, and the character becomes a cartoon. Too much of the other, and he stops being dangerous. Cobb found and held the exact balance throughout. Cobb later said that playing Johnny Friendly was one of the most genuinely exhausting things he ever did professionally. He had to find real aggression inside himself every single working day, use it fully on camera, and then release it entirely when the director called cut. What looked like a born villain was actually a gentle man working extraordinarily hard. Number 1. The walk that ended everything. The final scene of On the Waterfront is one of the most powerful endings in the history of American cinema. And what happened during the filming of it was just as remarkable as what ended up on screen. After everything Terry Malloy has been through, after testifying against the mob in front of the whole community, after losing his brother Charlie, after being beaten nearly to death in the alleyway by Johnny Friendly's men while the dock workers watched and could not or would not stop it, he has to stand. He has to walk. And the dock workers who witnessed everything he sacrificed have to make their own choice about whether they will follow him or stay under Friendly's thumb forever. Filming that ending was physically brutal in the most honest way. Brando had to appear genuinely broken by what had been done to his body. He had to walk with the specific stiffness and pain of a man whose physical self has been destroyed, but whose spirit, somehow and at great cost, has not. He had to make every single slow step feel like it cost him something real. To help Brando find the right physical reality for the scene, Kazan worked with him carefully on restricting his movement before the cameras rolled, holding his body tight, breathing shallowly, letting physical difficulty do the emotional work that no amount of acting technique could fully manufacture. And then, when the cameras rolled, Brando walked, slowly, painfully, step by careful step across that cold dock surface. And the workers, real men from the Hoboken area who had been used as extras throughout the production, fell silently into line behind him one by one. Kazan said later that when he finally called cut on that last shot, no one on the crew spoke for a long, full moment. The cameras stopped rolling. The scene was done. And everyone just stood there in the cold Hoboken air, feeling something they could not immediately name. A broken man walking forward, and slowly, quietly, the world following. That is not just a movie ending. That is what hope looks like when it costs everything you have. Bonus fact, the script that was never made. Most people know On the Waterfront as the story that Elia Kazan and Bud Schulberg created together. But very few people know about the script that existed before it, and the single moment when everything in cinema history could have gone in a completely different direction. Before On the Waterfront, there was another screenplay about waterfront crime. It was called The Hook, and it was written by Arthur Miller, one of the greatest playwrights in American history, the man who gave the world Death of a Salesman and The Crucible. Arthur Miller and Elia Kazan had been close creative colleagues and friends. In the early 1950s, they began working together on The Hook, Miller's screenplay about corrupt waterfront unions and working men trapped by criminal forces. The subject was almost identical to On the Waterfront. The moral passion behind it was the same. But The Hook was never made. Why? Because during the politically charged climate of the McCarthy era, pressure came from powerful people in the industry to change the story. Instead of corrupt mob-connected union bosses as the villains, an influential studio figure suggested the screenplay should reframe the antagonists as communist infiltrators, which would make the film politically useful to the anti-communist movement then sweeping through Washington and Hollywood both. Arthur Miller refused. He would not reshape a story built around real human suffering into a political tool for an agenda he did not believe in. He walked away from the project. It collapsed entirely. And not long after, Kazan testified before the government committee, naming names, including people Miller knew, and their friendship was destroyed permanently. Miller went on to write The Crucible, a searing story about false accusations, mass fear, and the destruction of innocent people by political hysteria. It was widely understood as his direct response to the McCarthy era. It became one of the most performed plays in American theater history. Kazan turned to Bud Schulberg, and together they built On the Waterfront from Schulberg's years of waterfront research. The film that emerged was, among other things, Kazan's public argument that speaking a hard truth, even at painful cost to people you know, can be an act of genuine moral courage. Two brilliant artists, one subject, two completely different films growing from the same dark soil. One chose silence as its weapon. One chose testimony. Both created art that the world still carries. On the Waterfront is more than a movie about docks and mob bosses and a man slowly learning to speak the truth out loud. It is a film about all of us. About those quiet, terrible moments when we know exactly what is right but feel too afraid to act. About the real cost of courage when courage is not easy or rewarded. About finding your voice in a world that has very strong reasons to keep you silent. It was made with real wind, real cold, real talent, and real conviction. Marlon Brando gave one of the greatest performances ever captured on film. Eva Marie Saint broke through as a star in the very first role she ever played on screen. Elia Kazan turned deep personal pain into something universal and lasting. And all the people working behind the camera, the writers, the cinematographer, the composer, the producer who refused to quit, poured everything they had into a story about ordinary people finding extraordinary strength in the hardest possible circumstances. These 20 facts are just small windows into a much larger world. Every film you love is hiding secrets like these, moments of accident and intention, courage and argument, love and difficulty, all tangled together to create something that simply lasts. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we'll keep uncovering them, one story at a time.